Sat Shri Akal and good evening from Maja House, Amritsar. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, someone who belongs here, belongs to Amritsar. He writes about Punjab and is deeply connected to Punjab's people and their issues. Hartosh Singh Bal. Introducing him and the context of his talk, Punjab in a Hindu India, is author and journalist based in Bangalore who's published a storehouse of information on Punjab and its contemporary history, politics, its social underpinnings, its institutions, and his book is called Punjab Journeys Through Fault Lines. Amandeep uh, and his sensitive, layered, extremely accessible, easy to read account gave me a book that explained a great deal about this land. For like Aman, I too have not been born here. I've not really lived here for any length of time, even though my father and his father before him lived in the villages and small towns of Punjab, undivided Punjab, for generations. And now that I live in Amritsar much of the time, I'm learning to see the differences and the huge gap between what exists here and what people outside perceive Punjab to be. This is the second in our newly started Maja House Conversations, which is a series of talks where we try to make sense of the mainstream and the marginal in contemporary India. The first talk in October was by Magsaysay Award winning journalist P. Sainath, who spoke of agrarian distress. He spoke about the disjunct between mass media and the way that mass media portrays all the real life, the real struggles of the people. And this is the second in that series. And each month we hope to do one really important talk so that we put forward some of the concerns and issues that seem to plague all of us. I'd like now to invite Amandeep to please take over, introduce our speaker, and let's go forward with the talk.
Thank you, Preeti. A real pleasure to join all of us here. Um, I Everybody knows Hartosh Bal is uh, a mathematician who turned a journalist. Uh, he came back to Punjab in the late 90s and started his from New York at that time to start his career in journalism. Since then, he has been with Indian Express, Tehelka, Open, and now has been with Caravan for a few years. One of the strongest and the fiercest political journalists that India has seen in many, many years. Um, but my introduction to Hartosh, I would take the liberty to go a little personal here because I owe Hartosh many things. I think I met him in 2012 when my second book had just come out, and he's at somebody else's book launch actually, and Hartosh said, "Come over to office and we'll talk." And I think we spent about 2.5 hours talking Punjab. Like Preeti, I too am not from Punjab. I was born in Odisha. And though I write about Punjab, but Punjab always remained either a mystery or, as I say in my last book, Punjab, I say a hole in my heart. And while I was in Delhi, we met a few times. And then I moved to Bangalore. And in the late 2013, at a Bangalore Literature Festival, the mood of the country was changing. And Hartosh and some other panelists got into a very, very acrimonious discussion on the future of India. Um, there was one speaker, I won't name her, but and everybody else was saying to say that there is a sense of India which we have, and the new party which is coming up, and it will change that sense of India. And the discussion kept actually degrading minute by minute, became personal, became volatile. And finally, Hartosh said, okay, if this is what you want to make India, then what would you tell Punjab? Punjab, which came out of militancy, Punjab, which has borne um, the struggle on its chest, thousands have died. What will you tell Punjab? This was 2013. I walked out from that meeting. The last 5 minutes, I just couldn't stand there because this was a question that hit me very, very hard. And now I wanted to work on Punjab, and I met Hartosh again, and he was very liberal with not only the time he gave me, we just like now we would talk even those nights, long, late into the night, I would stay over at Hartosh's place. He would give me many books to read. But like I say in my own book, there are 2 or 3 things that stuck with me with the people I was meeting to get introduced to Punjab. Like Satnam said, "Boohe baariye na dekhyo, thum bhi dekh leo." Look at the pillars of Punjab as well. Like Satpal Danish said, if you want to understand Punjab, learn to count its corpses. Similarly, Hartosh said something very important to me. He said, whether it is me or it is anybody else, don't take anybody's word as a gospel truth. You are traveling, you are journeying, test everything you hear on the ground from your experience. And that was invaluable to me as a writer who was actually trying to write a travelogue. He said, don't take anything for granted. Everything is up in the air. Choose what is your narrative of Punjab. And he also said to me that I could write for the Carwan and the magazine, and I filed about a story every month. It was completely up to me to decide what story to file, what issue to pick up, and he was very gracious. Karma is a very, very rigorous editing process. I love it for that, the quality of journalism that comes out from it. But every single story was carried, and actually those stories form the spine of my book. So in that sense, I owe Hartosh a lot more than just an introduction to this talk. The question that he asked in 2013, what will we tell Punjab, is actually the theme of our talk today. Punjab in a Hindu India. I would give Hartosh the space to speak. We will come back again in a conversation for some time, and then we will take audience questions. Please send your questions on the chat. I will keep noting them down and I will put them to Hartosh. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Amandeep, for the generous introduction. I look forward after this. I'll try and speak for a while and then talk to Amandeep about some of the issues that are raised and then maybe have some questions at the end. Once, Amandeep, our long conversations will have to be over water or whatever else that we have on our respective tables as we talk. The title of the talk, Punjab in a Hindu India. It's deliberate. It is meant to be provocative. It is thought out. It is a question. Aman has laid out some of the genesis. The person on stage that day was Madhu Keshwar, so it was no surprise that the conversation was of this nature. But it is also a question that has to do with something that was posed to Punjab over the 80s and the 90s of what are the dangers and threats of Khalistan or a Sikh nation to the Indian Republic. In 15 or 20 years, we have transformed that question. And today, if a Sikh nation, a monochrome Sikh identity, a small set of minorities could
outside
this. Sorry.
There is some disturbance. Can you please mute your? Yeah. In fact, request is to just keep Hartosh and my mic on, please.
So yeah, as I was saying, that a small minority could pose a danger to the entire republic. What today is the threat of a large homogeneous majority that wants to form a certain identity and impose it on a republic? What does it pose to those regions of the country where those are not conducive or are unwilling to accept the identity that this new regime seeks to define? And the choice of the term Punjab here is deliberate. I am not talking of what will happen to the Sikhs in a Hindu nation. I am not talking of a question of a minority versus majority. I'm talking of a place, a people in a certain part of India faced with a homogenizing tendency. What happens in this context? And to lay this out and to speak about it, I need to make sense of what this term Punjab, after all, means. When in the 80s or 90s, the question was asked of the danger a Khalistan or a Sikh nation poses to the Indian Republic, it was easy to define the Indian Republic. It was easy to talk in constitutional terms of an inclusive, secular republic and the dangers the idea of religious nationalism posed to us. So what does the idea of a religious nationalism now pose to Punjab, and what is this Punjab that is threatened by this religious nationalism that is becoming majoritarian, that is increasing across the country? So allow me my 5 minutes of idealism before I come back to the practicalities of what this Punjab is or how I seek to define this Punjab. Clearly, as it is in today, Punjab in India is the region inhabited by Punjabi speakers. And I want to stay with that. Who are these Punjabi speakers? Where does this idea start? What is Punjabi? And what is it that this region is demarcated by this language and separated from the rest of the country, what it shares and what it doesn't? And this story actually takes us back to exactly a millennia. And the story is actually quite contrary to the narrative that has been laid out by many of even our nationalist historians from the left who wanted to look at an Indian past, an Indian nation that goes back to Ashoka. Ideas, frankly, which were as ridiculous in some senses as the conception of a Hindu India and a great Hindu past today is. What happens at the turn of the millennia? We often confuse the advent of Islam with changes in India. Islam comes to India first, to Sindh, in the 8th century. And the Arabs, and this is the only arrival of the Arabs into India, and it stops there. The next great encounter that happens is an encounter that happens in Punjab and Afghanistan. And I just want to describe this encounter at the inception of Punjabi and what this encounter meant. Punjab at that time, and Punjab, by Punjab I mean the extended Punjab that extends up to Peshawar onwards, is ruled by the Hindu Shahi kingdom. Jaipal is the king, ruler, the Hindu Shahi ruler of Punjab. And facing him is, from his capital in Ghazni, Subuktigin. There is often between these two kingdoms clashes at the border. And the Subuktigin is expanding his empire along the borders while facing Jaipal. Faced with this constant attrition of the border, and Subuktigin is of Turkic origin. The first battle, the encounter between subcontinental forces and of Turkic Islam, actually happens when Jaipal invades Subuktigin's territory. It is not an invasion. The first encounter is an invasion by a Hindu Shahi kingdom into Subuktigin. That battle is lost. Jaipal becomes a feudatory of Subuktigin, does not accept that status, fights another battle, loses on the banks of the Kabul River, loses Peshawar. According to narrative then, he sits on a pyre, burns himself. Multan falls. The battle that he fights in Peshawar in the turn of the millennium, 1001, is fought with Subuktin's son. The son's name is Mahmud of Ghazni. That battle is lost. Finally, as a last stand, Jaipal's son, Anandpal, gathers together a confederacy of forces from Ujjain to Gwalior to Thaneswar, facing Mahmud of Ghazni, finally, in 1008, I think, and losing that battle. There are detailed descriptions of that battle. That battle, in terms of the changes in the subcontinent, is far more critical than the first, second, or third battles of Panipat. But since our history is written from the perspective of Delhi and from historians who sit in UP and Bengal, for some reason, the centrality of this change is always neglected. we are often forced to focus on the first battle of Panipat, which happens much later. And by then, the Turkic advent into India is a foregone conclusion. What happens is that the Turkic armies have military superiority in terms of techniques and tactics that the Indians have not mastered. And this becomes evident over a period of time. This whole story of Somnath, the Hindu angst over Somnath, actually is a byproduct of these battles which are happening between two kingdoms over territorial expansions. After the fall of Anandpal, what happens? Punjab is incorporated into the Ghaznavid Empire, and the Ghaznavid Empire is actually a massive re-energization of the Persian kingdom. And Lahore becomes, in some senses, the second city of the Ghaznavid Empire. The great poets of Persia, many of them are residing in Lahore at that time. They consider Lahore their hometown. And this lasts for 150 to 200 years. Along with the advent of Ghazni, through the Ghaznavid kingdom, what arrives in India are the Sufis, the names that we know: Data Ganj Bakhsh, Moinuddin Chishti, Bakhtiyar Kaki, and finally his disciple, Ganj Shakkar, Baba Farid. Baba Farid is born of a father who is from Kabul, a mother who is from Punjab, speaking Lehendi, and he becomes the first poet of Punjab. And this Persian, which exists as the language of Lahore for 150, 200 years, is grafted on Shorseni Prakrit, which has roots in Sanskrit. And the very formation of Punjabi is a direct coming together of Persian and this Prakrit. The influences of Turkic Islam from Afghanistan, which in any case was part of the subcontinent, of Shorseni Sanskrit, the Hindu Shahi kingdom, and the verses of Baba Farid, which form part of the Gurbani. Guru Nanak travels, I think, to Pakpatan, Ajodha, where Baba Farid is, meets the 12th descendant, I think, of Baba Farid, collects the verses. These become a central part of the Gurbani. They melt together with the verses of the Guru. And this vision that often that people seek to find whether the Gurbani comes from the Sant tradition or the Sufi tradition, actually, it is a meaningless discussion, because you can go back in both directions and find ideas and verses that fit in with the Sikh conception. The idea of the name, the Japna, Naam Japna, is already there in the Chishti Silsila for 200 years before the Gurban. It is this Punjab that I'm talking about. This Punjab, anybody who is inheritor of this identity, and I'm talking in idealistic terms, is not somebody who can lay claim to exclusively a Hindu identity, a Muslim identity, or a Sikh identity. It is meaningless in terms of this origin, this history. And this history also is a history that allows you to autonomously think of Punjabi identity, which is not tied down to any larger sense of some great conception of the subcontinent as one political whole. And this, while Punjab becomes part of the subcontinent ruled from Delhi as the Subedars of the Mughals are ruling Punjab, this sense of separateness, in some senses of identity, yet with a cohesion with the subcontinent, stays on. At the defeat of Ranjit Singh's successors, the army, after all, was fighting the successors. There was nobody alive. In the Sikh wars, writing at the end of the Sikh wars, Shah Muhammad is very, very clear in what he is writing. He's talking about outsiders coming into Punjab. And when he writes of these outsiders, the troops that are fighting the troops of Punjab, who are these outsiders he's referring to? Shah Muhammad refers to Dakkhanis, Hindustanis, Purbiyas, as a clear sense of people who are from outside Punjab, do not belong there, and Punjab has never had this presence there. In what sense? And we are talking of 1846, 1847. In what sense is this larger context of an Indian nation that extends to the deep past, which the left national historians have tried to construct, exist? It doesn't. But in what sense does the great Hindu past exist? And what meaning does it have in Punjab? It has no meaning at all. What does this new Hindu nationalism mean? Nothing at all. What we are saying is that something new was created in 1947 with the writing of the Indian Constitution with a certain set of values. And those values are what various parts of this country have signed on to. That compact is being changed today. This was, after all, as I said, the idealistic portion. What are the practicalities on both sides? What happened? The Indian Republic that we spoke about in the 80s and 90s, what was that Indian Republic? And how quickly was it able to transform into this more or less de facto Hindu nation? And when I mean Hindu nation, I am talking of a particularly specifically upper caste nation controlled largely by a Brahminical intellectual and Baniya capital, which is, of course, the status of the Indian state. You can see it very clearly today. That this transition happened because the elite controlling the Indian state or the Indian Republic was very much the same elite that controls it today. The idea of Brahmin intellectual and Baniya capitalism was also the idea that pervaded through the Congress. This idea of this elite that had modernized was sitting in a far greater reservoir of what you call Sanatan Dharam or ritual Hinduism that was part of their families, their extended kin, or wherever they sat. They were always a deviation from this larger pool through which they were ruling the country. And this idea of the Indian Republic, the idealism that pervaded through it was never in practical sense shared with what the rest of the Republic consisted of. Where were the Dalit participants? Where were the Adivasi participants? In large sense, where were the great OBC participants in this great experiment the Congress tried? And today, if the Dalit and the Adivasi are today willing to go along with the BJP, and let us not delude ourselves, a huge number are, because for them, the first idea of the Republic was as much an illusion. For them, the dangers that the Muslims are not part of this idea is because there is no choice at all. The threat that this new Republic holds out is enormous. But everybody else, denied what they were earlier, are today willing to compromise and participate to some degree in this modern idea of the Hindu nation, because in some senses, it is still a collaboration with the same elite that existed before and existed today. In the same way that the Indian Republic was in some senses a certain kind of myth, its ideals admirable but delusional. This idea of Punjab that I gave you at the beginning of this talk is also admirable, but in a certain way delusional. The idea of Punjabi today in Punjab does not exist. There is no sense in which Punjab itself today can lay claim to a large inclusive identity. And I just want to talk about the politics of Punjab and where it stands today, so we can see actually the real problems and the forces that shape themselves and confront each other when we talk about Punjab and the Hindu nation. And whether we like it or not, what is the demographics of Punjab today? It is roughly 60% Sikh. Among the 60% Sikh, it is 60% Jat Sikh, which creates a peculiar situation. It gives, through the workings of democracy, not in defiance of the workings of democracy, it gives de facto control to the Jat Sikhs over the affairs of Punjab. Say, even in Haryana, you can construct an anti-Jat platform of the others. But here, given this breakup between Hindus and Sikhs, what it means is that the Sikhs will control Punjab, and since the Jats control the Sikhs in a real sense politically, that the control over the political affairs of Punjab will lie with the Jats. What has happened to the Jats and Sikhism itself over the last 100 years is interesting, and we must follow it before we come to the current present in Punjab to understand why we are in this situation. I mean, modern Sikhism is also born out of the ferment of the 1890s, the early 20th century of the Singh Sabha movements. In that sense, it's an older idea than the Hindu nation, which is born out of the ferment of, again, the earlier 20th century of Hindutva and the Tilaks and Savarkars. So these people who actually plead for a glorious past are even more recent products than any other sort of diversity that exists in India. But if you look at the Singh Sabha movement itself, very early on, there is also, I have mentioned some of the issues of caste in Punjab when I refer to the Jat Sikhs and their dominance. There's an issue of class as well. The Jats themselves have been separated, especially because of the assumption of power in Punjab through Ranjit Singh, through the missiles. There is a distinct segregation of class in Punjab that comes up within the Jats themselves. The Singh Sabha movements themselves reflected. The Amritsar Singh Sabha is of a certain well-to-do class where the Jats and the Sikh Khatris are together. They are moderates, they are closer to the ruling British class. The Lahore Singh Sabha, in some senses, represents the Chote Tabke, the Jat. And this dynamics is present in Punjab politics throughout. The Akali Dal, the Gurdwara movement is born out of the ferment among the Chote Tabke. The well-to-do Jats, that includes the Chief Khalsa Diwan, they conduct their politics through the Unionist Party. The Chief Khalsa Diwan supports the Unionist Party. This distinction survives in Punjab politics for a great while. I mean, in some senses, the distinction between Congress and the Akali Dal ends in the 40s and 50s and revives again. A huge stream of this distinction comes to live within the Akali Dal and is played out in the politics of the 70s or 80s. When I came to Punjab as a reporter with the Express in the 97 was the year. The years of militancy had ended. And I mean, if you want the most iconic movement in this confrontation between less well-to-do Jats and the well-to-do Jats, you can go back to Blue Star. On one side is General Brar, on the other side is Pindranwale, both Brars, separated by a few kilometers in their villages, but separated by a huge distance through class. Pindranwale comes from a family that can't afford to bring him up. They give him to a seminary. General Brar comes from 3 generations of army men who've been to the best military schools, colleges, growing up in Bombay. And it is true that the well-to-do Jats have gained tremendously from the Indian state. The less well-to-do Jats have not, and that distinction is played out. And these streams are represented in the Akali Dal. When I arrive in Punjab in the early 90s, late 90s, I see the last vestige of these. I've said this before, the politician I'm talking about within the Akali Dal, Prakash Singh Badal clearly is a politician of the unionist mode, the well-to-do Jat, large landed families. So is Amrinder Singh. The distinction in these terms between well-to-do Jats and less well-to-do Jats is meaningless because both the Congress and the Akali Dal are largely today controlled by well-to-do Jats. The last representative of this stream, which starts from the Amritsar Singh Sabha movement onwards to the Akali movement, was Gurcharan Singh Toda. It is not that I like his politics. I have been very critical. I've written about it. But in some senses, he still represented a stream of politics in Punjab that did not represent the large feudal interests that Badal today carries with him. His marginalization, finally death, and the lack of representation of that segment today survives in Punjab politics. We are in a crisis in Punjab politics where for the first time, the complete consolidation of power is with well-to-do feudal Jats. The difference between Amrinder and Sukhbir Badal is irrelevant in political terms. The interests they represent, what they carry forward is almost the same. A change in government here does not make a difference. Because of this blindness within Punjab to this control, and this is a democratic control, it's not a control that has been imposed from above, because this is the nature of the demographics of Punjab, which has led us here, means that the diversity of views within Punjab, and I'm yet so far restricting myself to what is happening within the Sikhs, and I'm doing so because the Sikhs, with their majority, tend to control the politics of Punjab. In this politics of Punjab, where we have read so much of militancy, about so much of minority conscience, continuously one of the factors that seems to be totally absent or totally does not play out is the voice of the Hindu Punjabi, actually, of the Hindu who speaks as a Punjabi. And there have been traumas within Punjab that have not been articulated through the years of militancy, through the Maja, the migration from the villages to the towns, from the smaller towns into the cities, the constant fear. And I'm talking of the liberal Hindu who shares values with the liberal Sikh, who sees himself as Punjabi. I am not talking of the Punjab Kesari. I'm not talking of the attrition that from the language movement comes to Punjab, of identifying yourself with different mother tongues. But there is a trauma, a minority trauma of the Hindus, which no attempt has been made to bridge over yet within Punjab itself. And no recognition of that trauma has existed, because always Punjab articulates itself in Sikh terms continuously. Then within Sikhism and outside Sikhism is the trauma caste itself. In Punjab, there is a huge amount of Dalit politics, but that Dalit politics is a politics of a category. That Dalit politics does not act itself out in a unified fashion. The Valmikis, the Ravidasyas, the Mazhbis all have different interests. They do not come together to form a politics. The total number of Dalits would be as large as and larger than the number of Jats, but the Jats vote together in many senses, capture institutions and wealth in a way that the Dalits do not. And that domination has continued in Punjab politics. So what am I trying to posit? That the problem today of Punjab versus the Hindu nation is also a problem of a certain kind of upper caste elite that has taken control of the Indian nation, facing a state which is largely in the control of another kind of elite, the wealthy Jat, who is also using a certain kind of material and ideological formation to confront that state. And in this, large interests from both sides are being left out. And it will have its own play, because what happened through the 80s and 90s, and we are well aware, I mean, recent books that are coming out, I think one recently, large parts of it I may not agree, but the huge parts of it are actually very informative, which is about GBS Sidhu, who has written about the Khalistan conspiracy leading up to 84. He's a senior raw officer himself. He writes about what was happening. It's the same thing we have all documented, that it was in the end the personal political desires of Rajiv, of Fotedar, of Arun Nehru, the calculations of an Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi, which lead to Sikh militancy. In this, Bhindranwale himself is an active and willing participant, because he tends to gain in his own way by participating with the Congress. And then, as Sidhu writes, through the 80s, early 80s leading up to Blue Star, the idea of Khalistan, the exaggeration in the diaspora, etc., a great deal of it, and this is no longer conspiracy theory, officers who are posted there today are reported, is also the creation of Indian intelligence itself. And that state leverage has not changed. The change from the Congress to the BJP does not change the nature of the state that is dealing with Punjab. Those same ideas, the same techniques will be played out. What is the worry? The worry will always be that the moderate or even the less moderate Sikh politics that controls Punjab through the Jats may be outflanked by the specter of more extreme politics that may rise. Now, where is that specter to be created? If it doesn't exist, you must do so. One of the strangest things that has happened recently is the demonization of this Khalistan 2020 resolution. It is a ridiculous issue which has no resonance in Punjab. Pannu is a laughing stock even outside in the diaspora. Yet he has been put in the list of the 8 or 9 leading terrorists that threaten India's integrity in Punjab. Why is so much importance being given to a man like Pannu? Why does he suddenly matter? Oh, what is the demonization of this Khalistan 2020 movement? Why is it being done? Why is it of so importance when in all of Punjab you cannot get 5 people to back it up? This was the same thing In the early 80s, where were the speakers of Khalistan? Only one Jagjit Singh Chauhan, one Ganga Singh Dhillon. Where did these people pop up from? We still don't know. All I do know is that I met Jagjit Singh Chauhan when he finally pleaded his way back to his return to India. He was Taras Raya Siga Des Lai Apne. And I spoke to him in Chandigarh. Where were these people created from? That dynamics of the state, which we are today uncovering through testimony that is coming out now, is still alive today, and the same games will be played. Those games are played not because, and we must understand this, because there is some deep interest in Delhi to create trouble in Punjab. No, it is because it suits the politics. If it suited the politics of an Indira Gandhi or a Rajiv Gandhi to heighten the threat and then fight elections and claim their great ability to tackle internal threats, the very specter of an upper caste Hindu nation, which is in itself a minority conception, as it seeks to take along large sets of OBCs, Dalits, must constantly create the specter of fear. There is only so much that the Muslims can permanently contribute to the specter of fear. That specter of fear will sooner or later require other minorities who could be the scene of fear. And it is through this dynamics, things will be played out. In this dynamics, you must understand that the central government, the BJP that functions today, functions through a love of private capital and survives through fear. That fear can be invoked in Punjab. It is that need to cater to large private capital that determines the kind of farm laws that we are facing today, for example. In that sense, if Punjab thinks that the interests of Punjab will be part of the calculations of the center, quite the contrary. A little bit of trouble or a little bit of noise from Punjab, which is specifically a Sikh noise, suits this government eminently. And the change in the farm bills, what is happening, is part of a larger agenda in which Punjab is minor game across the country. The lack of contemporary thinking Punjab politics, because what has also happened with Punjab, the tragedy through this period of time, is that we must admit that the intellectual resources available within Punjab are extremely limited. A large amount of thinking, examination, critical, self-criticism within the Sikh community in particular, especially among the Jats, is absent because there is no such culture of honesty about one's own faults. That allows us to be very, very unprepared for what is folding around us. And in that, the inability to make sense of what it means to be Punjabi or a larger identity, always reducing questions to certain lenses. If you look at the past 10 years of Punjab, what has come out of Punjab? We saw the change in government, the anger over the government over the Bear movement. You today see the farm protests. Where in the politics of Punjab, I cannot today name one prominent figure who is a Hindu, who articulates himself as a Punjabi. But is that not the failure of the dominant politics of Punjab? Outside of Dharamveer Gandhi, I cannot imagine one major Hindu Punjabi political figure who has resonance across the state. Why does this happen? What is wrong with the politics of Punjab that 40% of the population does not find articulation or voice within Punjab? Is the concept of Punjab always going to be reduced to a Sikh conception, and within Sikhism, for all the conflation that may happen with various issues, always reduced to the interests of well-to-do landed Jats, and in some senses, a certain intellectual equivalence with the slight intellectual articulation which comes from the well-to-do Khatris of Sikhism. That ultimately forms what is the intellectual discourse of Sikhism. In that context, Punjab, as it seeks to look towards the Hindu nation, is actually in no position to preach and talk about problems elsewhere unless and until it is willing to look within. To me, with great honesty, the greatest figure, the Punjabi figure that has come out of the state is a figure that nobody in Punjab actually thinks of as Punjabi. And that is Kanshi Ram. That Kanshi Ram is not thought of as a Punjabi in itself, is to me a major problem. Yeah, the Kanshi Ram's politics, his understanding, his field of operation was here. I covered him in the late 90s, early 2000s in Punjab, in the Doaba. He was talking about a Bahujan politics. He was trying to talk of a politics that cuts across castes, which may reach out to various articulations, bring together a sense of politics that may be able to ideologically and numerically pose a democratic challenge, which could stand up to elite articulations that exist both in the Hindu nation and exist within Punjab through the Jat Sikhs. That politics has all but disappeared. In that sense, the reason this Hindu nation is a real danger to Punjab is because Punjab itself lacks the capability today to articulate a politics that actually is an alternative to the politics that the Hindu nation stands for. Punjab lacks the possibilities of a politics that speaks against the Hindu nation, but its identity is such that it can never be part of the Hindu nation. Caught in this trap, there does not seem to be any easy way out over the next 10, 15, 20 years, because in some large measure, there is little control Punjab has over what happens in the rest of the country. And that politics seems to be headed only one way. And if Punjab itself is not willing to look within and see what is the problems in Punjab, whether it is of agriculture, but I also want to emphasize that this constant return to agriculture, while important, is not sufficient. If you look at your own budget over the last few years, agriculture is not the dominant part of the economy any longer in Punjab. It surely supports a large amount of people, and which is why it becomes important, which is the reason it is important to the rest of the country. But in the articulation of Punjab's problems, I very rarely see a Punjabi articulation of what the problems with the services of Punjab are, what the industry of Punjab is, what has happened over a period of time among the politicians, of what has happened with the foundries of Batala, what has happened with the industries of Mandi Govind, of Khanna. These are issues that take second shrift to the constant focus on agriculture, which is important because it is destroying it. The large amount of livelihood in Punjab does depend on agriculture, and that through the Jats down to farm labor, people who work on farms, who benefit from farms, is huge. But that is also not the complete picture of Punjab. So this inability to holistically confront what the reality of Punjab is, to form a politics that articulates it, the great failure of the AAP. Why did AAP gain so much strength in Punjab? And it articulated itself through figures like Dharamveer Gandhi, through Sikhs who were not necessarily seen in terms of Sikhs, or Hindus who were seen as Hindus. It was one possibility of a politics which seemed to transcend religious boundaries in Punjab, which was able to find a response on the ground. And in the end, it was undone because it started with the wrong premises back in Delhi itself. I do not want to go into the history of the AAP and the problems with the AAP itself. But the reason that the failure of the AAP had nothing to do with the response the AAP got in Punjab, which is to say that the demand for such a politics is very much alive in Punjab. That response was a response born out of eagerness and a sickness with both the Akalis, the BJP and the Congress. That the AAP itself has let down this demand for a politics has to do with the AAP itself. That there is a viable politics in Punjab that will respond to and cater to appeals such as that is actually also possible. But that Punjab can itself now throw up the possibility, which AAP has already betrayed once, is what really the question that lies in front of us. Because in a real sense, what is going to happen in the rest of the country, to me, seems a foregone conclusion. It's not a question of when and if we will become a Hindu nation. We are in some senses already a Hindu nation. The only possible way of confronting it is if our response does not itself become a way of articulating ourselves through a Sikh nationhood or a minority nationhood, but some kind of Punjabi sense of politics that we can make viable on the ground. Thank you. That is what I wanted to say.
Okay. Can I speak? Yeah. So Hartosh, I'm reeling, reeling for the amount of information you gave everybody. I've been looking at the chat box, trying to take note of the questions that people are asking, but I think this was a stupendous amount of information, very vital, which we need to know to frame the context of what is going on. Unless we know this, actually, we can't really even start thinking about the issues that currently face us. But I'm very tied to the present. So I have some thoughts about that because, yes, it is important to know. Answers will come from true recognition of our history and our identity. Just to add to whatever you said, I think I also completely started looking at people as civilizations. And in that sense, we are the Indus civilization people forged onto the Gangetic plains. And then further, there is a Brahmaputra civilization. South, there is Narmada and Kaveri civilizations. You did the fantastic book on Narmada. So, but how do we deal with the onslaught on Punjab has been there. That's why my book was called Fault Lines. But what is currently happening is dire. And what I see is that except for one day when the three political parties in Punjab agreed to pass some bills which will go nowhere because the governor won't approve, the president won't approve, the Supreme Court won't approve. Similarly, the Punjab promise that Punjab government is trying to make to farmers on MSP can't be viable because the center won't release funds. There have been large-scale protests. Punjab is now facing the other side of it. Trains are being stopped from coming to Punjab. We have a coal crisis, power crisis. Flipped, it actually is an interesting thing that the public-private partnership thermal plants have closed down and Punjab is buying electricity at a cheaper rate. But then we are not getting DAP, we are not getting urea, we can't plant wheat. And it is very true that there is not much of labor voice in these protests. There is not much of the Artiya voice in this protest. There are women joining in huge numbers, but there isn't enough women voices in these protests. How should this configuration of a protest change right now so that we can actually, I think in many, many decades, this is the first time Punjab has come together to a large extent. It didn't happen in the Ramyud Morcha, it didn't happen in the Punjabi Suba movement, it didn't even happen earlier when there was a unionist and there was a Congress tilt. Now Punjab has come together, but we don't know how to articulate our thoughts. What would you say to that?
Well, the question is, we've seen over a period of time, unless and until movements have some kind of organic drivers, you can look at what happened with Shaheen Bagh, that it actually thrived without a leadership. In Punjab, whether it was the Dharam Yudh Morcha or whatever the great agitations, the Gurdwara agitation, that very rarely do you get movements which don't have a political center to it, which can survive over a long period of time. It is very difficult to take it forward, which is why I'm saying that the need for some kind of politics that will be viable and that looks at the long term is necessary. Otherwise, you will have protests that will die down, rise again and go back, and the grievance will be articulated in other forms which can go in any direction at all, or that they can leave Punjab divided, they can be used for articulating whatever measures it is. The one thing that Punjab has to recognize is that through a large degree of omission of its own politics, we have reached this point. You have written about the Green Revolution. We have written about how Punjab has become the basket for paddy, especially wheat, we were always producing, but this intensive cultivation of paddy, wheat with large investments of fertilizers, etc., is also new post-Green Revolution. This period of time is a period of time the rest of the country, having survived on the surplus that Punjab was producing, has used to diversify in agriculture. Today, Madhya Pradesh is a larger wheat producer in some senses that Punjab is, and is going to provide more to the central pool. Other places of the country are growing more food. Punjab's vitality, the central reason why so much money was willing to be committed to MSP, to distribution, was because there was no other choice before the country. That situation is disappearing. Punjab is not going to be central in that sense because there are other parts of the country which are growing enough food soon to be able to feed the rest of the country without the surplus from Punjab. This period of time is when Punjab has taken no opportunity to do anything on the ground that would move it away from these things. Of course, the center has a part to play in that. Of course, the center had to cooperate. But I was in Punjab in 97 and today it's 2020. And the discourse over paddy, diversification, over what needs to be done, over agro industries, the same, I can take some of my articles that I wrote in 1998 and publish them today and they will seem current. Nothing has changed. And we cannot keep looking back and saying Delhi did this. Those 23 years, we have been governed by our own politicians who did not see any necessity of changing this on the ground. So yes, as the protests look at the center, the question is, where is the viable politics that suggests a way out? Even if the center decides to cooperate with what is happening in Punjab, who will it cooperate with? Who in Punjab has an articulation of the kind of actions on the ground that are necessary that will change this current situation? Where are the ideas? Where is the articulation of what we do as we diversify away from paddy? I saw one ANI tweet about how Punjab Agricultural University, they were saying we will build furniture from paddy husk. I've been hearing this for 25 years. I mean, if that is the best idea that one can manage, we are in the ridiculous, basically. And the failure to provide our own responses. So in that sense, the protests are necessary because there is a short-term problem that needs to be taken care of. But that short-term problem by itself is not the basis for a sustainable politics.
But protest is necessary, but in my opinion, protests work on two lines. One is by cutting off either the economic pipeline to the functioning of a state. And Punjab is in the corner of the country. It's not like Madhya Pradesh. You stop trains and the whole country gets divided. Punjab is actually on the corner, and that's exactly what happened. We stopped trains and they didn't care. Right?
Absolutely.
It's not even like Shaheen Bagh, where you actually stopped a vital road in Delhi and then the police stopped other roads and everybody suffered.
Sure.
And the protest gained some traction.
Absolutely.
And then it was misused by the powers. Second, protest, or if you look at historical Punjab, the Land Alienation Act or the water bills in the canal colonies, the British had to take back those laws because they wanted to recruit soldiers from Majha.
Sure.
Right? So we don't have that kind of an economic hold on the country anymore.
Sure, absolutely.
And second is protests work if there is the enemy or the opposition has a conscience. That was the protest of whether it is Baba Ram Singh or it is our Master Tara Singh and the Gurdwara movement and Mahatma Gandhi. The Satyagraha protest works when the opposition has a conscience. This Hindutva nation, I mean, yes, our topic is Hindu nation, but it's actually a Hindutva nation. It does not have a conscience. It has not, Modi has not taken back a single law he has made. BJP wants to look like this strong arm bully, which gets its 31% vote, and that is eternal. I mean, there will be 31% stupid people, who will keep voting it. So what should Punjab do?
Well, see, I mean, in the sense, these are responses that come out from, no one person can say what Punjab can do. What I'm trying to say is that Punjab must recognize certain realities which lie in what you've said, that Punjab has lost its centrality in strategic terms. It is no longer vital to food security. Well, will not be vital to food security 5 or 7 years from now. For those next 5 to 7 years, it is still necessary. The country would have had a difficult time surviving through COVID without for food security, much of it still was dependent on surplus that was generated from Punjab and Haryana, which is what has kept Modi alive through this period. And it is something that the back of his mind, he still understands. But these are things that are on the downswing. The dependence is decreasing, which is why you could even envisage something like a farm bill, which has been put up today. Because in the end, you are looking at other parts of the country. You are looking at other interests. You are no longer concerned about how Punjab draws, how the politics of Punjab affect food security in the country, because Punjab is no longer going to be vital to food security in the country. So the strategic leverage that comes from our own strength has disappeared. Second is that we are facing a situation here, which is, and I do not want to get into the debate, but for me, this articulation and this division between Hindu and Hindutva, the political use of religion and religion itself, is not something that I'm so clear that you can draw a line very, very clearly and say that it lies on one side or the other side. I think that that articulation is, and at some point, maybe not in this forum, this debate of whether there is a Hinduism outside Hindutva and where it exists and why it has disappeared, is something that we can debate. So, I mean, I'll stay with the terminology I prefer, that the Hindu nation that has come up outside this country is unwilling to, at the moment, consider a common human equation with the other, whether that is a Muslim or a Sikh or anybody else. And within this articulation, we are led by politicians who are driven solely by particular self-interest in terms of the vote. And for them, Punjab is just another place from which you can strategically extract political mileage that will suit you in terms of the vote they want. They don't want Punjab's vote. The vote they are looking for, and which is why I am not drawing the distinction between Hindu and the Hindutva vote, is the Hindu vote. Now, whether that Hindu vote comes through Hindutva or otherwise, or whatever cause it comes, the vote they are looking for is only the Hindu vote. They are not interested in any other vote. They don't care. It does not matter to their success, any other vote. So that interplay in democracy, when you reach out for the votes of every part of the country, is totally missing in the current situation.
Absolutely.
So that is the bind in which every part of the country which does not have significant leverage is caught in. That is a problem that cannot be changed from within Punjab. That cannot be a problem that can be changed from within the Northeast or from Kerala or from Tamil Nadu. In the meantime, the question is, as long as that problem is not entirely resolved, if it is ever resolved from within the Hindi belt, from Gujarat or Maharashtra, what does the rest of the country do and how does it face up to this? And in some senses, the larger answer in the rest of the country is the same answer that I gave for Punjab, that the long-term viable politics which AAP was offering, which was a politics that Kanshi Ram had first given rein to, that has to exist outside the country, that has to exist outside Punjab, it must exist within Punjab. So in that sense, there is no Punjab to give voice to it. Those are voices that have to come up from within from an intellectual political churning, which realizes the gravity of our current situation. That seems to be missing in Punjab today.
Actually, the 31% vote that BJP got in 2014 is exactly the equivalent of the Bahujan vote in Punjab, the 31.9% Dalits. And yet there is no formation of a Bahujan party in any viable way. I mean, there is some remnants of the BSP. But if you have to flip the question around or look more deeply into what the center is doing, actually the call is for greater federalism. It goes back to India, union of states, so the center likes to focus on union. The states want to focus on states. This articulation came up with the Raja Mannar panel report from DMK in 1969, came up with Anandpur Sahib resolutions. There were 2 or 3 of them, 73, 78 later, on the West Bengal memorandum. At that time, they were all sort of sidetracked. They were actually given a bad word. And the BJP recently came up with the GST, which they came with a new term, cooperative federalism, which I don't understand what it means. And we saw that it failed. The The center does not have money, which it has already taken as taxes to pay to the states. And these demands that Punjab is now making, or which other states, Kerala is making, Northeast is making, Kashmir is making, these are actually calls for greater federalism, a federalism beyond the cow belt, basically. How can Punjab carry this narrative forward at this stage?
So look, first of all, it's a federal project that has been tried many times through an articulation of states coming together. When Lohia in '67 first got together many parties on an anti-Congress plank, it was basically a federal plank that required both the left and the right to come together. I mean, the Jansangh became viable through that plank. The left fought elections with that. That plank was actually aligned with the right. The reason today you have a Badal or many other parties which were, whatever else has happened recently, let us forget it, but from the larger sense, that instead of a federal plank that they became allies of the BJP is because the federal plank actually became participant in the BJP's notion because it was born out of an anti-Congressism. It will take a long time before now the shift happens to the other side, where you will get a formation which is anti-BJP federal project in some senses. But even for that, you need viability on the ground. You have to look at how many states that is possible. You would have thought a few years ago, because the BJP realizes that this is the danger, and it is reaching out to ensure that that danger does not catch it off guard. You would have thought at one point of time that Haryana would be one of the articulators of the federal project. Haryana today is very much part of this, the Hindu nation, of this Hindutva project that has happened. Its ability to create local parties that will articulate local interests is almost disappearing. The Jats, who were once seen as outside the caste system, have become great defenders of Hinduism in a few years. Whatever the reality or where it will lead them later, they will find out for themselves. But the same problem is true of Rajasthan, it is true of Gujarat, it is true of UP, it is true of Bihar, that if federalism has to be articulated, it needs the numbers behind a federal structure. As soon as you collect together the states I'm mentioning, the problem for the Indian Union lies that there is a Hindi belt imperialism which, affiliated with Gujarat and Maharashtra, is more or less in control of this country. Within that, how do you get a viable federalism to emerge when the numbers do not allow it to happen? This is a strange kind of imperialism which is born out of the most resource-deprived parts of the country, who are actually taking resources. It is a colonialism of the well-to-do in some senses by the most deprived parts of the country through a democracy where these numbers have actually armored them to be able to do this. You are getting a drain of resources from the south. You've got a drain of resources from Punjab. You have got extraction of, I mean, the water crisis in Punjab, the sinking of groundwater is basically a permanent drain of Punjab's resources to feed the Hindi belt in some senses. The flow of economic wealth from the south, that is the surplus one, to keep Bihar and UP going is also a drain of surpluses to feed this area. There is nothing wrong with it. I think there is a huge problem in the Hindi belt. There are problems there. People have to be fed, etc. But this problem then is not acknowledged as what it is, that the give and take that should exist in a union is not happening, because there is this drain from other parts of the country, and yet a political domination which is based entirely on numbers, but with no contribution to the larger structure of the country. What I'm trying to say is the answers are not easy. Yes, it is the requirement of a federal structure, but narrow interests in each state have also led us down. Badal should, the Akali Dal, at least, Badal himself, there should be no hope. So, but the Akali Dal, in the way it was formulated, should have been at the forefront with many other states if it was actually genuine in its politics of what it articulated. It never was. I mean, to be fair, the Akali Dal claim to minority politics was never true. It was always a claim to Sikh politics. They could not say so within the constitutional limits, but given now what the BJP is, I think it is absurd. We might as well be honest. The Akalis are not a minority party. They are not a federal party. They are a Sikh party, and they are looking to represent Sikh interests, and that is how they are operating on the ground. And they have lost an ability to do that because of the Badal family as well. So a federalism that has to come through has to be through a genuine Punjabi party, a Maharashtra party, a Kerala party coming together and talking about the need for a separate kind of arrangement of the union for it to succeed.
Yeah, but that's where the problem lies, no? Like, and
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up the Gujarat mafia. I mean, we are Sikhs. I'm Sikh at least, and I know what labeling my community did to us in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But it's very unfortunate to see that most of what is happening today is driven by one group of people, and that's extremely sad. But Hartosh, put your hand on your heart and say, do you think that this party in power today really cares for India? Do they really have a vision which is even 10 years long? I mean, RSS thinks about Akhand Bharat. They keep talking about making India strong, Atam Nirbhar, and all that. But I look at them, and I am an anxious guy. You are on the ground. You are constantly filing, processing stories that are coming to you from around the country. Do you really think that this BJP has a sense of where it wants to take India in 25 years? I don't feel that. I don't think they care whether we disrupt, we whatever happens, as long as they've looted, they've looted. That's my sense of it.
First of all, I must say that I hope there's nothing in what I've said that would indicate that I think the BJP has a conscience, basically. It would be absolutely a travesty for me to suggest that. But yeah, of course, they have a vision. They have a vision that is, look, you must see and appreciate it in a vicarious sense in which you would appreciate sinister tactics from anybody played out over a long period of time. The RSS has always been clear of what it wanted. From 1925, 1930, you look at its articulation, the rest of us believe and continue to believe, no, it could never happen, that there is the diversity of India, this could not happen, that could not happen. The RSS said they'll bring in 370. The RSS have said many other things. They will build a temple. All the liberal argument or the rest of the country's argument, but this is not the idea of India. The diversity of India will not allow it to happen. This is not how India functions. It cannot happen. Nonsense. It has happened. And so their vision is very clear. It may not be a vision for India, but it is a vision where society would be crafted and structured in the form they want, with the politics that allows them to perpetuate themselves. That is a pretty clear vision, and that will only progress. You will see that we will have their version of a uniform civil code. You will see other movements towards largely something that has already happened on the ground. In what other sense does this country have to change to become a Hindu nation?
No, I completely agree
So,
with that.
so what I'm saying, that vision is very clear for the next 10, 25 years. I mean, it is that we must remain in charge, and our incursion into every aspect of society must increase from what it already is. I constantly say that the RSS today is the most powerful non-governmental organization in the world. And in that, I include the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party has had to give up the sort of communist idealism in which to retain its hold over society. It also holds society. But the RSS has managed to shape India largely into its vision today. It is this, let us not delude ourselves that this 31% is only 31%. The other 70% is not people who are voting against the BJP. Plus this 31% within the Hindi belt is far larger than 31%. Yeah, it's the same thing, that after all, how much the Jats are 26% of Punjab's politics. They can control it forever. This 31% located within the Hindi belt is a permanent control under democracy over how India functions.
Right. But my question comes from all the human indexes dipping, like more poverty, more hunger, more illiteracy, more health issues. And how do you build a nation without working on human development index? That's where I'm coming from, whether you can really build the nation.
Well, in the short term, the answer is clear. No, I mean, those dangerous Muslims, and when that answer fails, that maybe those dangerous Sikhs.
Yeah.
I mean, the psychosis of fear and this belief that religious fundamentalism will go away as the indices fall. No, poverty, desperation, situations growing bad actually drives up religious fundamentalism, which is what we fail to understand. That, I mean, and the perception that you look at what happened in demonetization. I don't want to get into analysis of the rest of the country and Modi. I mean, but there is no easy hope out, in the sense that these guys will vote themselves out of power through that stupidity. Does not seem to exist.
No, it doesn't. I mean, Trump might be out, but they are here for another 15 years at least. No doubt in my mind. I'm bringing that to another question then, because you mentioned those dangerous Sikhs. So in that context, uh, you must be aware that there are UAPA being uh, put on young boys in Punjab. This idea, you mentioned it briefly in your talk as well, say Pannu's idea of Khalistan, but it's also a huge undercurrent in Punjab. It is, I also argue in my book that it doesn't seem viable. Uh, we understand that, but how do we, can we at all? I mean, can Punjab at all fight this label that the center might want to stick on Punjab anytime they want? And they do it all the time. I mean, those boys, one of the boys, he was actually a volunteer at Shaheen Bagh. He later committed suicide. You know, 3 boys have been put in life imprisonment because some material literature was found from them. I mean, that literature is all over the internet. There is nothing special to that literature. It is the gaze of the center, abetted by the state. It happened during Akalis, it happens during Congress. How can Punjab fight this anti-national pro-Khalistan label that is stuck on Punjab?
See, this is where the whole larger consolidation that we are talking about. One of the reasons, for example, that we saw in terms of these protests in Punjab, where is that the absolute, totally absence of coverage in the national media. As you said, Shaheen Bagh, at least in Delhi, people had a realization what was happening in Punjab passed unnoticed largely. So in that sense, there cannot even be some kind of democratic empathy with some people who may be opposing the Modi government, because largely most of them don't even know what is happening in this part of the country. These are reports buried on page 5 somewhere, page 6 somewhere, or not appearing at all, while Modi's Mann Ki Baat is on the front page. That is one part of the story. But in a larger sense, this branding and articulation is something that they have done across. And as I said, the Congress, the nature of the Indian state has not changed. Intelligence agencies, this kind of branding has been practiced before. It has been practiced in the late 70s, early 80s, before it got out of hand and they didn't know what they had created, or maybe they did. I mean, this branding has been used to put in people like Sudha Bhardwaj into jail. What is the kind of literature? To have a book of Che Guevara's lying here, or a book on Khalistan lying here? In what way is this more problematic than to have Veer Savarkar's book lying on your table? But one is okay today and the other two can get you booked under the UPA and jail for whatever reason. And all of us, you and I, will have all 3 books because it is our need to be reading it. And if tomorrow they decide to come to our houses and look through, there is enough material in the kind of cases that have been constructed in Delhi after the Northeast violence in Delhi, the anti-Muslim violence in terms of Bhima Koregaon, that all of us could permanently be in jail because there was subversive literature found in our houses. Of course, there will be subversive. What literature itself is subversive. If we are reading, we are trying to engage with the world, we are journalists, we will have this kind of material. But you're right. This labeling, the UAPA question is very, very dangerous. Most of these are young men who are doing nothing but looking around aghast at the state of the country, do not have real answers around them. There is nobody talking to them in Punjab itself. And they're looking and searching for whatever they can find somewhere here on the internet, somewhere here on whatever, trying to construct some coherent vision of the world which will let them get on with very little material at their disposal. And that is leading them to a UAPA, a law which is being used. You can see the use, that political use. You saw it in Trudeau's visit, that even a visiting head of state was made to look like a facilitator of Khalistan because of the presence of a person at a banquet hosted by Trudeau. But that man was somebody that the Indian state was in direct communication with, that the Home Ministry was communicating with that person. So the Indian state was not wrong to communicate with that person, but the banquet with Trudeau, because it could be utilized both to label Trudeau, because Trudeau is in some senses one of the critics of whatever is happening in this country. But even at a time when he hadn't come to criticize, but to visit the country, politically, it was opportune to use that advantage to build a certain narrative. They did. So in that sense, they will use anything.
Yeah, but my concern remains that how to fight this, but yeah, the issue is there. There is one last question from me, and there are, I think 100 messages in the chat box. I don't know how much time we have. But the question that I have is, to me, quite important, might resonate with others, is as we said, Punjab is in the corner of the country. Punjab had a particular system of its economy, and it has fallen out of sort of the country doesn't need it so much. Punjab will also transition, land holdings are becoming smaller. There is a migration going on. Depeasantization is part of what is happening in Punjab. At the same time, I wonder, why does my wife's uncle in Trishur want the rice from Punjab? Kerala is 3,000 kilometers from Punjab. Tamil Nadu is 3,000. And on the other hand, Pakistan is just here, a few meters away. There's a farmer protest going on in Pakistan for rising in wheat rates. Pakistan has a huge cotton shortage. Punjab has a cotton surplus. I know Pakistan is considered our enemy, but is there a chance at all that Punjab can start trading via Pakistan, via Afghanistan, with Balkans, with Eastern Europe, with these parts of the country? In the 70s, the Shah of Iran used to send trucks to gather potatoes from Punjab. Can Punjab at least negotiate that much with the center in these 4, 5, 6 years that the nation will take to get food sufficient? Punjab might have a little leeway to negotiate these kind of things with the center. Can it do that at all in this regime, this climate?
Look, I mean, rationality would recommend this, but what happens? We've seen that what happens each time trade opens up with Pakistan. Every time that a political gesture has to be made to say that Pakistan is troubling us, threatening us, the first thing that happens is you stop the trade, because that is a good gesture to show to the rest of the country that we are acting. That does not hit this country at all. It hurts Punjab. The actual skirmishes on the border hurt Punjab as well. And the lifting of trade and then shutting it down hurts Punjab. So we've gone through the cycle several times over. There are a number of times the border has opened, the trade has happened, but it will always be subject to the vagaries of whatever use. Not that Pakistan is a very admirable state to begin with. There is enough trouble coming from internal problems within Pakistan, though it does lie within the cultural boundaries of what we call Punjab. I mean, the history of Punjab that I invoke certainly involves Punjab on the other side as well. If Navjot Sidhu went and said the only honest thing that he wanted to say, which is that he feels more at home in Punjab than he does in Tamil Nadu, that's an obvious truth. I mean, what is there to be amazed about that? Obviously, it is going to be true. But that there are problems rising for there, and there is convenient use of Punjab to be made all the time with this government, means that it is never going to remain a viable option. This is what should happen in a rational world structured around what Punjab needs, where its position is, how it should conduct its trade and its agriculture. Obviously, a huge amount of its market lie on the other side. I mean, Amritsar as a pre-partition city and the kind of city today has to do with the dying of this whole trade connection that existed once. Right. The Majha itself and the suffering of the Majha is largely a result of the new changes within Eastern Punjab and what kind of politics that has happened. And Majha is largely neglected. That problem started first in Majha, and Majha was the greatest articulator of Sikh sentiment in some senses, was also a result of the fact that Majha was also the most neglected part of Punjab within Punjab as well, basically, in its politics.
In fact, some say the partition was of Majha and not of Punjab. So. Yeah, I'll go to some audience questions. Preeti, how much time do we have? We are already at 1 hour and 20 minutes.
Another, maybe you can go up to 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, Gurupdesh sir said, I raised my hand last time, nobody listened to me. So, so I really want to start with his question because, but there is a suggestion which just came to me, Preeti. Brilliant comments are coming. There's a very healthy discussion going on. Not all can be answered. Can somebody save this file? And when you put it up on Majha page, we can put all these comments. I mean, let people keep discussing more and more.
Definitely. Yeah.
Because yes. I mean, in the last questions.
We'll get the chat history. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, in the last two questions, 34 new messages have come. So what can I do about that? Yeah. But Gurupdesh sir took us back to something which we started with, is that and it's an important question in Punjab's context. He said, is the bonhomie between the Sikhs and the Hindus skin deep, or is there more to it? Because when things change, even families which have both Sikh and Hindu members, things go cold even between them. So, what's your comment on that?
It's a difficult question to answer. In some level, each of us will answer that question individually and at individual levels. But in a larger context, it is easy to see that, and we must always look at questions of majority and minority as questions of majority and minority which are universal. That is, if we move aside from the dynamics of Sikhs and Hindus in Punjab and look at the fact that there is a 60% population of a majority and a 40% population of the other, and the rest of the country has a majority of the people who are 40%, it creates a certain dynamics that will operate in that same way, irrespective of what those particular communities are. It is because in the nature of give and take for power, the Sikhs are going to dominate power in Punjab. It will mean a sidelining of Hindu interest, as it has meant through Punjab over a period of time. Then the Hindu of Punjab will try to make common bond. I'm not talking of individuals, but in terms of large communal formations that tend to speak for one community, will try to make common cause with the larger source of power in the center and try to extract some privileges for themselves because of their failure to get privileges within the state itself. It creates a certain perpetual dynamics that will continue to play itself out. In that sense, the idea of Punjabiyat or Punjab that I tried to articulate is very, very dead in a real sense. There are people, there are individuals, there are places, there are groups in which it continues to exist. But in a larger sense, all our articulation is today happening through community, and within community through caste. Hence, yeah, maybe we can collect 5-10 people together, put on some ghazals and pour out 2 bottles for ourselves. Suddenly we will discover Punjabiyat, but it lasts for that evening.
Within community, caste, and within caste also, because gender is a huge issue with Punjab. I've broken my head with 3 books. I've not been able to cross over. My own birth is a limitation. There is a healthy amount of questions which are around what is RSS doing with Punjab, with cultural Punjab, with religious Punjab, and the design of RSS on Punjab. People seek to understand from your point of view.
I think what you will see is a resurgence. The actual attempts that the RSS made in Punjab were at a far greater height through the 90s and the early 2000s. In some senses, the strong stand taken from the Akal Takht against RSS activities, the backlash from within the community to the activities of the Sikh Sangat had an impact. So the overt, but the constant reuse, the desire, this constant argument that we have to live out outside this, that as a Sikh, you will be told, but you are Hindus. And who are these people who are defining themselves or defining us as Hindus? What is this Hinduism? There is no coherent shape they can give to their own ideas, but Sikhs are Hindus. As I told you, this modern idea of being a Hindu is actually younger than the idea of being Sikh itself. So that you are a Hindu is an absurd formulation, but for RSS, it's the core of its being. That is why, more than anything else, they are discomforted when somebody with a Sikh name and a Sikh identity continues to call them out or question them, because they have no easy way out, because to label a Muslim is they are looking to be questioned by Muslims, because that is then another way of listing. Oh, but then Aurangzeb did this. Why are you talking about this now? I mean, perpetually the bringing up of the past. With the Sikhs, that becomes difficult. And they do not like that criticism. For that very reason, they are looking for a larger sense of trying to create literature. Look at the Supreme Court in the Ayodhya. One of the significant observations was using a Janam Sakhi to support the construction. I can only say that this is absurdity by the court. It is, and I say it on record, it is absolutely lack of intellectual sense by a judge to use a Janam Sakhi whose own conception probably has been analyzed and dated and probably dates from the 18th century, well after the events that the Janam Sakhis claim Supreme Court is claiming to be history. But that is being used. You look at, I am planning to write about it recently. So the example came, Ram Madhav is writing in the Indian Express. The organizing is publishing it with no basis in Sikh history, that Guru Gobind Singh fought in Ayodhya with the sadhus and actually defended Ayodhya from Aurangzeb's army. It is all being conjured up, but what is laughable to us will tomorrow be the basis for a Supreme. It is this kind of nefarious activity on the ground that the RSS constantly does. And the RSS has been able to expand its presence in every place in Punjab also is because the Akalis is this collaboration between Badal and the BJP, rather than the Akalis and the BJP, had allowed a huge amount of space for RSS and allied organizations for their activities.
So I think we are 1.5 hours, you must be tired. But Hartosh, if we can, before I give it to Preeti, we have covered most of the things that I can browse through. I've been taking notes. We have covered most of the things. If there are 2 or 3 things you would want to say to Punjab at this stage, what would they be? I mean, you might have to just summarize your own talk in that sense, like, for example, one big issue is in Punjab, the connect between the people and political parties. There's a huge disconnect between them. And in this whole farm bill issue itself, we have seen. We saw it even in the sacrilege thing. They did a special session in the assembly for God knows, 10 to 12 hours. And finally, nothing came out of it. It's been 3 years to that session as well. So how can the people, of course, organic, of course, Kanshiram, of course, BSP, but there are many more suggestions to can this gap between the people and the politicians be narrowed down? What kind of politics Punjab needs to articulate if it has to really survive in this Hindu India?
So the point here, Amandeep, and I can occasionally just mildly sense your frustration about when you ask me what should be done. And
I know, but people expect an answer. I know. We can continue for 7 hours without reaching anywhere. We are doing a performance. People.
So my issue with that is actually I don't have answers. I am a journalist. I can tell you these are the problems. This is what is unfolding. This is what has happened in the past. This is where it could lead to. Answers come from a different sphere. It is political answers. I'll tell you the systemic problems. I told you the well-to-do Jats, the farm problem. It's also a systemic problem with Indian democracy across the country, particularly magnified in Punjab. What do I mean by that? When I was leaving Punjab, it was about 2000. I covered the elections. At that time, I had calculated, rough calculation, and I repeated this at several places, is that I'd calculated that one candidate to stand for one assembly session then in 2097, 2099 had to spend somewhere around 70 to 75 lakhs just on alcohol. Yeah. Today, that figure may have gone up 4 times, 5 times. That's the kind of election expenditure we have seen go up. You have across the country, you look at now the Election Commission requires you to submit your the wealth you have, your means, whatever you possess. That the one diversity that doesn't exist in legislatures across the country, including parliament, is a diversity of class. There are no poor people in the legislature anywhere in the country. 2/3 of Punjab's legislatures are crorpatis. And the proportion is increasing with every election. As election be more and more, our constituencies is so large. our representation of class is becoming in the same way that sooner or later we are going to have legislatures filled only by the Ambanis and Adanis because nobody else can afford to stand for elections. And this is actually the trend across the country, exacerbated in Punjab, where the expenditure is even more because of things like alcohol, which are consumed in greater quantities. In that context, the people who are standing for elections and who are sitting, in what sense will they be affected by the Farm Bill? Or in what sense are they personally affected in any sense? They also see that when the election comes, I mean, I think this is one of the conundrums that the left parties across the country have realized, is that they will work for people on these issues. They will carry out a dharna, and the same people who will come for the dharna and sit with them will go vote for the Akalis or the Congress when the time for the election comes. That even if these issues are significant, they don't become reasons around which politics can coalesce. Challenge is that there has to be a political answer, a political solution, which is why I look back at the doomed AAP experiment and what it did to Punjab and the damage it has created, that there is an opportunity clearly there when people responded. Now that opportunity has to be tapped by someone, some people who are entering the political sphere. That we can only lay that out. I mean, that is how that leadership emerges, how political alternatives are created. It is not in our hands, neither can we give it a go or whatever else. That vacuum certainly exists, that possibility exists in Punjab.
No, thank you very much. I mean, this has been exhausting, but I think for me, it feels like once again back to our sessions. Like we were talking your seminal understanding of Punjab when the Akali Dal took over SGPC. Remember in Goa, we were speaking about that. I think that collapse of the Miri Piri in some ways has really destroyed Punjab in terms of the Sikh politics point of view. So and Toda was ousted and Badal came to power. Thank you very much. I will not even try to summarize. I will hand back the mic to Preeti because we must put up these comments that are coming. It's brilliant. And thank you very much, Hartosh. COVID days, let them get over. We shall meet soon. Bye-bye. I'll give it to Preeti. Yes.
Thanks, Hartosh. Thanks, Aman. If Aman has like put up his hands, I am not the one who's going to be summarizing this. But yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that you said hit home, and I think it has hit home for a lot of the people who've been listening in today. And this whole thing about looking for a viable politics, a viable alternative, where are the ideas, where's the articulation, all of that, I think we all need to think deeply about it if we plan to make any headway at all. I'm sure everybody's got a lot of stuff to think about, but I am now going to ask Artika Bakshi, who is here in the audience and who has volunteered to talk to us and to basically give the formal thanks. She is somebody who, she's Indu's daughter, and she has been coming for all our sessions and also giving a lot of interesting feedback in the chats that you probably have been seeing. Artu, please come. And if you've, can we see you now?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Mrs. Gill. I've been told a lot of times that I have not lived in India since the last 23 years. So what right does it give me to give my comments or to, actively take part in discussion? But like Amandeep had said earlier, we have all come here with our own narrative. And I think all of us, we were 90 to start with and now around 58. We have come with our narrative because Punjab means a lot to us. And generally, whenever we talk, I've been listening to some of the Maja House sessions, and Mr. Bal, your sessions where you were interviewing others were also interesting. And the nice is that it's the presenter who also brings out the best in the person he's interviewing. So Amandeep, thank you so much. I look forward to reading your book as well. We've come here with our narrative, but it's painted a little bit of a bleak picture. It's reality. Thank you. It's reality. So I think most of us who are going back today are going to be thinking of how this can be solved. religion has nothing to do with it. I mean, the title was Punjab in a Hindu nation, but if we have not sorted out our own backyard, how are we going to take a stand on a national level? Knows where we are going to start thinking. I wish there are more people pay attention to these issues and think about them. For you to put that forward, where people, start thinking about these things. Wishing everyone all the best. And thank you, Mrs. Gill, for such a fabulous session. I mean, all the sessions have been fabulous. Thank you.
Thanks, Hartika. And thank you, both of you. Thank you, Hartosh and Aman, and the audience and the team at Maja House for putting this thing together. Good night and thank you. And I've put what we have for you tomorrow. If you have time, please do join us. It's the session of Sanja Punjab, where we get in East and West Punjab together. We are doing a session on Allama Iqbal. Saida Hamid is curating it for us. We will have his life, a profile, and then readings from his work. Readings will be from both East Punjab and West Punjab. Do join us if you have time at 6 o'clock again. Same. Good night.
Right. Thank you
And
so
bye-bye.
much. Thank you.